The life of Pedro Rodrigues, Pilho, the man who would become the dark legend known in Brazil as Pedrinho, Matador began under the shadow of violence and fatality. Born on October 29, 1954, on a remote farm in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, in the southern part of Minas Gerais state, Pedro entered the world already marked. He bore a physical scar on his skull, the brutal result of domestic violence inflicted by his father, Pedro Rodrigues, who, during a fight with his wife, repeatedly kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant with him. For an American reader who might associate being born in the countryside with an idyllic childhood, it's crucial to grasp the social reality. Life in rural Brazil, especially in the mid-20th century, was often defined by an almost complete absence of social safety nets, allowing cycles of abuse to continue unchecked. Pedro's wounded skull stood as an early testament that violence was not merely an external force in his life, but an intrinsic part of his being, one that had marked him since the womb. The household was volatile, steeped in fear and repression. At 9 years old, seeking refuge from a toxic home, Pedro went to live with his godparents in Santa Rita do Sapucaí. But the peace didn't last long. 3 years later, around the age of 12, the rage simmering inside him began to spill over. One day, after witnessing his father beating his mother, the boy reacted with a mix of desperation and defiance. He grabbed a gun and confronted him, shouting, "If you ever hit her again, I'll kill you." That moment marked a point of no return. From then on, his father began carrying a weapon and forbade Pedro from coming near the house. The man who should have been a source of protection had become his first true enemy, and the living embodiment of the injustice that would follow him throughout his life. A few years later, in a final act of escape, Pedro left Minas Gerais and headed toward the dangerous energy of São Paulo. For readers used to the vast expanse of the United States, it's important to grasp the weight of that journey, leaving the rural interior of Minas Gerais for São Paulo meant crossing the line between quiet farmland and one of the largest urban centers in the southern hemisphere. A landscape of stark contrasts, boundless opportunity, and pervasive crime. In São Paulo, still a teenager, Pedro survived by committing petty thefts in the city's downtown and east zone. His criminal path escalated quickly. Around the age of 13, he is believed to have committed what would later be described as one of his first murders. Jorge Galvão, a local drug dealer from the Itaquera neighborhood. According to some accounts, Pedro also killed Galvão's brother and brother-in-law. In other stories, Pedro himself would later recount in interviews he claimed his first crime happened even earlier, during a fight with an older cousin that ended tragically when the cousin was shoved into a sugarcane press and then finished off with a machete. It's crucial, however, to place these accounts within the broader context of the complex psychology that would come to define him. Researcher Ulysses Campbell and the psychoanalyst who would later work with him, Dr. Asa Shah, both point out that many of these stories were likely fabrications, mythic narratives constructed to reinforce his self-image as a killer. The alleged crime against his cousin, for instance, was never corroborated by any official records. Before his eventual capture, Pedro spent a period on the run in Mogi das Cruzes. In 1973, at just 18 years old and already behind bars, he received the news he feared most. His father had murdered his mother. The weight of guilt crushed him. He felt personally responsible for the tragedy that destroyed his family. She'd been struck 21 times with a machete. Pedro, the eldest son who had always vowed to protect her, carried that guilt like a curse. He believed that if he hadn't been in prison, his father would never have had the courage to commit the crime. The sense of helplessness and shame drove him into a consuming rage. Before that final arrest, Pedro had lived as a fugitive in Mogi das Cruzes, where he began a violent climb through the criminal underworld. There, he started robbing drug-dealing spots known as Bocas de Fumo and killing rival traffickers. During this time, he met Botinha, the widow of a slain drug lord, and soon took over both her affection and her late husband's illicit operations, eliminating 3 competitors in the process. That period marked his full immersion into organized crime, where violence was the only currency of power and survival. On May 24, 1973, Pedrinho was captured and sentenced to 128 years in prison. But vengeance for him couldn't wait for justice. Behind bars, the myth was born. According to the story he would tell for decades in interviews, documentaries, and countless conversations, Pedro learned that his father had also been imprisoned in Mogi for murdering his mother. From that moment, his wounded mind crafted the perfect setting for catharsis. He said he organized a Coria prison term for a plotted move or operation, and with help from other inmates managed to reach his father. What followed, he claimed, was a scene of unbridled rage, almost biblical in its intensity. He stabbed my mother 21 times, so I stabbed him 22, Pedrinho would often repeat. It became his mantra, a brutal, blood-soaked logic of retribution. He said he used a puxera, a large knife common in rural Brazil, not a gun. The story grew even darker in the way he told it. People say I ate his heart. No, I just cut it because it was revenge, you know? I tore off a piece, chewed it, and spat it out. The scene, grotesque and theatrical, was never confirmed. Pedro's father, in fact, died years later of tuberculosis. The supposed parasite existed only within Pedrinho's own narrative, a myth of personal redemption, not an entry in any criminal record. Dr. Issa, the psychoanalyst who spent time with him in his later years, recognized this tendency to embellish his stories as a textbook case of mythomania disorder, in which a person constructs an emotional truth to withstand an unbearable reality. For Pedro, consumed by guilt for not having saved his mother, casting himself as the avenging hero was a means of survival. The fantasy shielded him from psychological collapse. Without it, his ego would have shattered. The climax of that fantasy was the imagined final conversation with his father. After the attack, according to him, his father looked him in the eyes and said, "You did the right thing, my son." In this distorted version of reality, the killer became the hero, and the father's forgiveness, though imagined, became the tragic seal of the myth known as Pedrinho Matador to an American audience. This story resonates directly with the Oedipal complex, the repressed childhood desire to eliminate the rival father. In the Brazilian context, where the justice system is often seen as slow or ineffective, only about 10% of homicides are solved. According to criminologist Ilana Kasoy, Pedro was transformed into a kind of vigilante's son who carried out society's unspoken desire for revenge. However, later research by scholar Ulysses Campbell uncovered the cold truth behind the myth. Pedro's father had died years after his imprisonment. Within the penal system, from tuberculosis, respiratory disease common in Brazil's overcrowded prisons, he hadn't been murdered at all. The mayor Pedrinho claimed to have killed in Minas Gerais had also died of natural causes. Even the cousin supposedly murdered in his youth may have been a fabrication, a coping mechanism to process the trauma of having been sexually abused by a child predator while on the run as a boy. For Pedrinho, killing his cousin at 14 was a symbolic act, a way of killing the past, of destroying the abuser and the pain he represented so he could start anew. The Brazilian media, however, ran with the myth. Pedrinho, a compulsive liar who came to believe his own traumatic fantasies, was branded as Brazil's most prolific serial killer, claiming to have taken more than 100 lives. In reality, only 71 were ever confirmed, and the number of murders for which he was actually convicted, and which weren't products of myth, was far smaller, likely around a dozen. Once inside the system, Pedrinho Matador ceased to be just a violent criminal. He became a force of nature within Brazil's prisons, a figure whose notoriety transcended the walls that confined him. Brazil's prison system, often marked by inhumane conditions, overcrowding, and the absence of state control in certain wings that allow criminal factions to thrive, offered the perfect stage for Pedro during his transfer to prison. Handcuffed inside a cambaratha, a Brazilian term for a police transport vehicle, or, in prison slang, a bond, Pedrinho found himself next to another inmate convicted of rape. The air inside the cramped vehicle was thick with sweat and fear, the tension almost unbearable. Even restrained, Pedro managed to kill the man, cementing his immediate reputation as an avenger. He didn't kill indiscriminately. His violence was selective, targeting those he considered worthless people, rapists, traitors, and above all, other criminals. This perverse sense of morality helped shape his popular image as a vigilante, a man who exacted revenge on behalf of the weak or in place of a failing system. It's a narrative that mirrors the American fascination with figures like Charles Bronson's character in Death Wish, or Frank Castle, the Punishermen who take justice into their own hands when institutions fail to deliver it. On his left arm, he had tattooed the words that summed up his philosophy: "I kill for pleasure." His time in maximum security prisons such as Araguará and later the Casa de Custodia de Taubaté, then considered the most secure facility in São Paulo, a kind of Brazilian supermax, was marked by blood. At Araquara, he was accused of being one of the founders of an alleged criminal organization called Black Serpents. In 1985, he took part in a prison riot that left 4 inmates dead. In another incident, he beheaded a prisoner accused of murdering his sister. His justification was chillingly detached. He was my friend, but I had to kill him. To the harsher side of society, he became an anti-hero. Criminologist Alana Casway, who studied him closely, said Pedrinho wasn't a vigilante, he was an avenger. His allure lay in what he represented, the reflection of a society where justice often failed. If the system does nothing, then let Dexter be our hero, many thought, drawing parallels between him and the protagonist of the American TV series Dexter. Pedro, who had never attended school, taught himself to read and write behind bars. That detail is crucial. The prison system was his battlefield, but also his university. He read voraciously, devouring books like Roots and Works by Sidney Sheldon. Later, he would use that intelligence described by Dr. Issa as remarkable to manipulate the narrative surrounding his own life. Pedrinho's sentence was astronomical, over 400 years, when adding up the crimes committed both inside and outside prison. However, Brazilian criminal law Article 75 of the Penal Code imposed a cap on time served. At that time, the maximum limit was 30 years. It was later changed to 40 years in 2019. Thanks to that limit in 2003, despite a 128-year sentence, he was slated for release. But the crimes he committed while incarcerated extended his stay. His time in prison wasn't just about punishment, it was about survival and power. In 1987, during a fight at the Casa de Custodia, Pedrinho nearly killed Josmini Ramos, a notorious Brazilian plastic surgeon who was also a convicted criminal. After 34 years behind bars, on April 24, 2007, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was released for the first time, although he could have been freed in 2003. New sentences for crimes committed while in prison delayed his release until April 2007. The weight of freedom after so many decades must have been overwhelming. He moved to northeastern Brazil, settling in the city of Fortaleza, Ceará, in search of a fresh start far from the place where his infamy had begun. Pedrinho's first taste of freedom was short-lived. In September 2011, news outlets in Santa Catarina in southern Brazil reported that he had been arrested again. He had been working as a caretaker on a rural property in the countryside of Cambaruyu. This time he was ordered to serve an additional 8 years for crimes of mutiny and false imprisonment committed while he had been incarcerated in São Paulo. The cycle of release and reincarceration dictated by past offenses within the prison system revealed just how difficult it was for Pedrinho to adapt to life outside the world of confinement and violence. His second release came in 2018. At 64 years old, having spent 42 years of his adult life behind bars, Pedro Rodrigues Filho claimed to have converted to Christianity and found remorse. It was at this point that the figure of Pedrinho Matador began to morph from the legendary killer to the reformed ex-killer. Brazil, with its intense media culture and fascination for redemption arcs, no matter how controversial, embraced the new Pedrinho. He launched a YouTube channel and began giving interviews warning young people, crime isn't a game. Many get into it chasing the branches, fame and money, but not the roots, prison and death. It's like the devil. He gives with one hand and takes with the other. The 64-year-old man, his face weathered and his voice raspy, was being filmed for a documentary about his life. Andrea dos Santos, a production assistant, described him at the time as a child trying to live again. The image of the monster burdened with 400 years of sentences was giving way to that of an aging survivor, a former inmate seeking public redemption. In 2021, Pedro's life took a dramatic turn, one that would place him under a clinical microscope and humanize him in a way no documentary series ever could. He had been out of prison for about 3 years when he fell into a period of deep instability. He was emotionally unbalanced, and there was a real fear he might kill again. Pedro felt dissatisfied, claiming he'd been used and tossed aside like an old cap by those around him since his release. A neurologist, intrigued by the idea of studying the brain of a killer, sought help for him. But Pedro refused to see psychologists or psychiatrists. He said he'd been mistreated during his time at the Casa de Custodia and no longer trusted professionals within the system. The doctor then introduced him to Dr. Issa, a psychoanalyst and therapist. Their first contact was online. Dr. Issa would later become, in Pedro's own words, the person who finally made him feel that he'd had enough of doing time and being used. Her initial goal was to help him reclaim the childhood he couldn't remember. The therapeutic approach quickly evolved, incorporating elements of schema therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Their relationship deepened. Pedro eventually moved into Issa's clinic in Itanum, a coastal town in São Paulo where he lived for 1 year and 8 months. She jokingly referred to him as her human laboratory. He would laugh and reply, "I'm your guinea pig." Pedrinho Matador was a persona. The man living in the clinic was Pedro Rodrigues. In Itanum, the contrast between the myth and the man was startling. The serial killer who once claimed to have chewed a piece of his father's heart was, at Isa's clinic, a model of discipline, hardworking, dedicated, and caring. He looked after Isa's 8 pets and charmed everyone around him. He was incredibly kind, Isa recalled, carrying her bag, helping her tenant with groceries, always eager to lend a hand. The man she saw every day was far from a psychopath, Isa insisted. A true psychopath feels neither fear nor empathy, but Pedrinho showed both. He could tell which of the 10 animals was having stomach pain and would tend to it with care. His behavior at the clinic didn't match the legend of the killer. To Isa, the figure of Pedrinho Matador was a kind of psychopathic defense. The killer persona was a constructant. She suspected he suffered from dissociative identity disorder, shaped by the trauma of his abusive childhood and years spent surviving on the streets. Therapy sessions revealed a pattern of mythomania. The killer was a mythomaniac, someone who creates a fantasy and genuinely believes it as a way to endure reality. He wasn't consciously lying for personal gain. That's what separates a liar from a mythomaniac. Pedro truly believed in his own invented stories because they were his only means of coping with the guilt of his mother's death and his overwhelming sense of helplessness. The myth of Pedrinho served a purpose. On a primary level, it soothed his rage. On a secondary level, it earned him respect inside the prison system and notoriety outside it. When Pedro realized that people were fabricating stories about him, he never corrected them because those stories sold better. His need to sustain that image was so powerful that he inflated everything, even the body count. When Isa asked about the small blood drop tattoos on his leg, each one said to represent a life he'd taken. He brushed it off. "Ha, I lost count after a while," he said. "Doctor." Isa worked to dismantle the myth and plant new dreams in Pedro's mind. She helped him sublimate his impulses, introducing humor into their sessions and teaching him to handle the anxiety of life outside prison. A life he bluntly called a piece of crap. During his time at the clinic, their relationship evolved into what Isa described as a therapeutic friendship, grounded in an ethic of care. Pedro, who was in the adolescent phase of schemotherapy, began to assume a paternal role toward Isa, looking after her, worrying excessively about her safety. This blurring of roles, though misinterpreted by the media as a romantic relationship, was in truth a reflection of Pedro's deep, unmet need for connection and care, something he had never experienced before. Isa's project was focused on his social reintegration and the eventual writing of a clinical essay on her therapeutic approach. He was, in fact, changing. The man once sentenced to hundreds of years in prison now sat by the beach, giving advice to local teenagers and trying to steer other lives in a better direction. Yet the past cast a long shadow. His fame continued to draw attention. A doctor from Paris, another from Peru, and one from England reached out to Isa. Film producers bought the rights to turn his story into a movie or documentary. Pedro received a payment for the exclusivity, the amount that, while modest, stunned him. "I've never seen so much money in my life. If I'd met you when I got out, I'd be rich." Life as a former killer was a constant struggle between redemption and the pull of the old ways. In the months leading up to his death, the tension in Pedro's life became almost tangible. He was restless, feeling once again betrayed and used. After his release, Pedro had been taken under the wing of a businessman, an ex-convict named Pablo. Pedro trusted Pablo, but Pablo let him down, using him in shady schemes and breaking his promises. Pedro's fury returned. He decided he was going to kill Pablo. It's crucial to understand that, for a man who had spent 4 decades behind bars, justice was something immediate and visceral, and vengeance, an almost instinctive need for control. On his way to carry out the plan, Pedro met a pastor who invited him to a rural recovery center for people struggling with drug addiction. Pedro, who had always been physically disciplined and never addicted to hard drugs, he only smoked Beck, a marijuana joint, since he was 14, threw himself into the work at the property, cutting weeds, clearing land, working non-stop. But history repeated itself. The pastor exploited him too, filming Pedro's Bible studies for a YouTube channel that went viral while paying him next to nothing and feeding him poor limousin pasta with sausage. Thin and exhausted, Pedro asked for a minimum wage salary. The pastor refused and Pedro left. He went back to Mogi das Cruzes, to his sister's house where he was living as a guest. For a brief moment, he gave Pablo a second chance. But the encounter ended with Pedro beating him like you'd discipline a child, a humiliating display of dominance. "If you pull something like that again, you already know what'll happen," he warned. When Pablo crossed him again, the break was final. It was then that the doctor reached out to Isa, and Pedro returned to the clinic in Itanum, seeking refuge and resuming his work with her. By February 2023, in the weeks leading up to his death, Pedro was deeply on edge. He had been receiving threats, and though he refused to involve Isa in what he called trouble, his demeanor gave him away. "My daughter, I'm not going to drag you into this mess. When I came to your house, we made a deal. It wasn't going to bring crime here," he told her, holding to his personal code of honor. He knew people were after him. Dr. Isa noticed Pedro was in a kind of farewell spiral. He began visiting all his childhood friends in Mogi, retracing an emotional path from his past. He bought a gun, a sign that despite all the therapeutic work, the vigilante life was creeping back in. Without Isa realizing it, he was using her to create what he called a treasure map. He would send her videos from Mogi, insisting she post them immediately on his social media. "Post it now," he'd say, urgent, wanting everyone to see he was there. "Are you going to tell me what you're doing?" Isa asked. "In the right time, you'll know." "If you don't hear it from me, you'll find out somehow," he replied, his silence heavy with fatalism. On the Friday before the Sunday he died, he fell ill with a fever and couldn't make it back to Itanum. Isa, teasing him about his newfound faith, said, "That's God punishing you. You abandoned me." He picked up a photo of her and held it up to the camera. "I never abandoned you, see? You're right here. God knows my heart and he knows I'm here to protect you." On the night of Sunday, March 5th, 2023, Pedrinho was back in Mogi das Cruzes, the place of his imprisonment, and the stage for his imagined revenge. He was near his grandparents' house, one of the most defining places of his childhood, where he had planted a lemon tree he visited in his final days. It was as if his death had been meticulously scripted. On Saturday night, he told a friend he was tired and had already paid for all his sins on earth. He handed her the gun he'd bought, asking her to keep it for her own protection. That Sunday, on Jose Rodriguez da Costa Street in the Jardim Nautico neighborhood, the chronicle of his foretold death became reality. In broad daylight, two hooded men stepped out of a car. The sound of their footsteps on the street in Mogi was likely drowned out by the gunfire that struck him 6 times. And yet, in a final act echoing the savagery of the world he had tried to leave behind, the attacker slit his throat with a kitchen knife. The body of Pedro Rodriguez Filho, the man who had built his legend on 22 stab wounds, lay in the street. He had died unarmed, reacting on instinct, just as Isa had always feared. Pedrinho Matador, the outlaw vigilante, the Brazilian anti-hero, died the same way as his victims. His violent public death sparked a wave of backlash against Dr. Isa, who was viciously lynched online, a common Brazilian term for being ridiculed and attacked on social media. Followers of the myth claimed she had ruined him, saying the real Pedrinho Matador would never have died without fighting back. But the one who died that day was Pedro Rodriguez, the 68-year-old man trying to reinvent himself. Although journalist Ulysses Campbell investigated the murder, and Pablo, the former manager who betrayed him, remains among the suspects. More than a year and a half later, the case still hangs unresolved, a tangle of loose ends marking the final chapter of Brazil's most notorious serial killer. The legend of Pedrinho Matador, or Pedro Rodriguez Filho, cannot be truly understood by outsiders without diving into the Brazilian psyche surrounding crime. In Brazil, where the justice system is often viewed as corrupt, slow, and ineffective, the figure of the vigilante fills a deep emotional and sociological void. The pull Pedrinho had over women. Women were in love with him, as many said, and over the public, who treated him like a celebrity, was deeply unsettling, yet revealing. He was the man who did what the police and the state failed to do. The fascination was so powerful that he became one of the key inspirations for Dexter Morgan, the protagonist of the American book and TV series Dexter. The show's international success earned Pedrinho the media nickname the Brazilian Dexter. The duality between the man Pedro Rodriguez and the myth Pedrinho Matador remains the defining legacy of his turbulent life. He embodied the fantasy of vengeance, the primal wish to see evil swiftly and brutally punished. The fact that he wasn't a psychopath, but rather a man suffering from severe identity dissociation and mythomania, trying to erase a lifetime of helplessness, frames his story from one of pure evil into a study of deep psychological trauma. He was a violent, distorted reflection of social failure, a product of the very system that caged him. His biography, as recounted by Dr. Isa in her work, is a psychoanalytic biography, the subjective truth of a man who needed to believe he had chewed through the heart of evil itself just to avoid being consumed by his own guilt. Pedro Rodriguez Filho, the human guinea pig, was a mirror reflecting the violence that Brazil so often chooses to romanticize in the face of injustice. a dark, distorted outlet for a society's desperate cry for order and retribution.